Have you ever wondered what would happen if compassion itself broke the laws of biology? If one act of mercy, one heartbeat, could rewrite what an entire species believes about survival? In the frozen silence of the Bering Strait, nothing lives long. Not humans, not hope, not love. But that night, a broken man named Eli Turner shattered the ice anyway, and pulled from the black water something the universe had long forbidden: connection. She wasn't human. And yet, as she breathed her first stolen breath of air, he felt something ancient move inside him, the irrational will to save a stranger who wasn't meant to be saved. Empires had fallen for less, species had burned for smaller mistakes. But that's the human paradox. We rescue what logic says should be left to die. And somehow, the universe changes around that choice. Because humanity doesn't just survive the impossible, we become it. Before we begin, subscribe, like, and tell me from which city or which world you're watching. This story explores one question the stars still can't answer. Why do humans save what they don't understand? The ice screamed when Eli Turner brought the sledgehammer down. 23 degrees below zero, wind tearing at his face like claws, and all he could see through the fractured surface was something that should not exist. A body, pale and luminescent, suspended in the black water beneath the Bering Strait. Her hair moved in translucent strands, glowing blue in the darkness. She was drowning, or maybe she was already dead. Eli didn't stop to think. He just swung again, and the ice shattered like the last pieces of his sanity. When he dragged her out, his thermal gloves steaming against her skin, he saw the gills. 3 parallel slits on each side of her neck, fluttering weakly, gasping for water the way his lungs gasped for air. Her eyes opened, and they were wrong. No pupils, just opalescent orbs that seemed to see through him, into him, beyond him. She made a sound, not quite human, not quite anything, and Eli's first coherent thought was, "I've been alone too long. I'm hallucinating." But she was real. Cold as death, but real. He carried her to his cabin, a half-mile across the ice, feeling her weight against his chest, her breath against his neck. Shallow, irregular, dying. The drone he'd been testing, Cortana 3, followed overhead, recording everything with clinical precision. Later, he would delete the footage. Later, he would realize that choice had already sealed his fate. In the cabin, under the harsh fluorescent light, she looked even more impossible. Skin that shimmered like wet glass. Fingers slightly too long, joints bending at angles that made his eyes hurt. A fishing net was still tangled around her left leg, cutting deep, the wounds leaking something that wasn't quite blood. Illegal trawlers, he thought. They'd caught more than fish tonight. Eli had exactly one skill beyond photography: battlefield triage. The Coast Guard had trained him well before Marcus died, before Sarah left, before he'd chosen ice over everything warm and living. He worked fast, cutting away the net, packing the wounds with gauze, monitoring her breathing. She convulsed twice. He thought he'd lost her. Then her hand closed around his wrist and he felt it, a vibration, deep and rhythmic, traveling through her skin into his. Not a touch. A language. She was trying to tell him something. He had no idea what. By morning, she was gone. The cabin door stood open, snow drifting across the threshold. Eli found his first aid kit emptied, the gauze carefully folded and stacked on the table. In the center of the stack sat a small object, a piece of shell, carved with symbols that hurt to look at too long. He turned it over in his hands, feeling its unnatural warmth, and knew with absolute certainty that his life had just ended. Or perhaps it had just begun. He couldn't tell the difference anymore. The next day, they came for him. Eli was testing the ice depth near the shore when he saw them emerge. 10 figures rising from the water in perfect synchronization, their movements almost ritual, their bodies draped in garments that seemed woven from living light. They walked on legs that bent backward at the knee, their feet leaving no prints in the snow. The one in front was her, the woman from the ice, Sharael, though he didn't know her name yet. Didn't know anything except that she was looking at him with those impossible eyes, and behind her the others were watching him like he was either a miracle or a mistake. They stopped 3 feet away, close enough that Eli could see the subtle differences in their skin tones, ranging from pearl white to deep turquoise. Close enough that he could see the ornaments they wore, scales that pulsed with bioluminescence, shell bracelets that hummed with a frequency he felt in his teeth. Close enough that when Sharael stepped forward, he could smell her. Salt and ozone and something ancient that made his hindbrain scream predator even as his conscious mind whispered wonder. She placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. Her palm was cold, but the vibration that passed through her touch was warm. The others dropped to their knees in the snow, a gesture so synchronized it had to be rehearsed, or instinctive. When Sharael spoke, her voice was like water over stones, each syllable modulated through frequencies Eli felt rather than heard. This man is my bond, by current, by breath, by heat. Eli laughed. It was a nervous sound, high and broken, the kind of laugh that comes when the universe stops making sense. One of the kneeling figures, ancient and scarred, raised its head. Its eyes were the color of deep ice, and when it looked at Eli, he felt judged by something older than nations. A log of observation was being compiled in that moment, though Eli wouldn't learn the details until much later. The designation in their records, surface creature detected, body temperature 37 degrees Celsius, lethal to sacred spores, behavior anomalous, broke ice with primitive tool to reach Sharael, suggested protocol, thermal elimination, status pending. In their language, in their biological codex that categorized all life, humans fell under a specific classification: pyromortalis, heat death carriers, creatures that emit constant thermal radiation, consume organic matter through chemical combustion, survive in gaseous environments. Probability of communication, 0.003%. Threat level, maximum. They had words for humans. None of them were kind, but Sharael had invoked something older than fear. A law so ancient that even the council had to honor it. Kamir, guardian of the breath, the one who returns life to the sacred current. By their code, by pulling her from the water, Eli had bound himself to her protection. Duration, permanent, penalty for failure, soul fragmented, eternally cast from the cosmic current. There was no precedent in 4,000 lunar cycles for a warm-blooded creature to bear this title. Eli looked at the woman who'd apparently just chosen him as her husband. She was still touching his chest, feeling his heartbeat, her expression unreadable. He thought about his ex-wife Sarah, about the divorce papers he'd signed 5 years ago in a lawyer's office that smelled like coffee and failure. He thought about Marcus, frozen in the Bering Strait, and the Coast Guard report that had cleared Eli of wrongdoing even though he knew he'd lived when he should have died. The old report was still in his cabin, buried in a drawer he never opened. Incident at Bering Strait, it read. Mechanic Marcus Webb, killed in action. Mechanic Elijah Turner, survivor. Hypothermia class 3. Recommendation, psychological discharge. Status, rejected by officer. He'd carried that rejection like a second skin, lived inside it, let it define the shape of his isolation. Now, standing in the snow with 10 impossible beings kneeling before him, Eli realized he'd been waiting for this, for something bigger than guilt, bigger than grief. Big enough to either save him or finish what the ice had started 3 years ago. He looked down at Sharael's hand on his chest, felt the vibration of her pulse synchronizing with his, and made a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Okay, he said. Okay. The Ancient One rose slowly, its movements deliberate. When it spoke, its voice carried the weight of centuries, each word a small act of violence against the air itself. But Eli understood nothing, only felt the warning in his bones. only saw the way the others looked at him, with fascination, with fear, with something that might have been hope or might have been the prelude to murder. Shariel pulled her hand away, and Eli felt its absence like a wound. She gestured toward the water, toward the darkness beneath the ice. And Eli, who'd been half dead for 3 years, who'd chosen cold over warmth and solitude over risk, who'd lost everything except the compulsion to document his own slow disappearance, did something he hadn't done since Marcus died. He chose to follow someone into the dark. The question wasn't whether he'd survive. The question was whether he wanted to. The entrance to their world was a wound in the ice, a vertical shaft that dropped 200 meters into darkness that sang. Eli could hear it even before he descended, a thrumming that wasn't quite sound, that resonated in his chest cavity and made his teeth ache. The Narathi moved down the shaft like they were born to it, their bodies undulating in ways that defied skeletal structure. Eli followed on a rope, his thermal suit groaning with each meter of depth, his hands already numb despite the gloves. At the bottom, the world opened up. Bioluminescence transformed the subglacial cave into a cathedral of light. Structures that might have been buildings or might have been living organisms pulsed in blues and greens, their surfaces covered in the same symbols Eli had seen on the shell Shariel left him. The Narathi moved through their city with the fluid grace of creatures who'd never known gravity as an enemy. Eli stumbled after them, his boots too heavy, his breath too loud, his body radiating heat that made the nearest Narathi flinch away like he was toxic. He was. His body temperature, normal for a human, was lethal to the spores that formed the basis of Narathi spirituality. Every breath he took was a small act of violence against their ecosystem. They knew this. He could see it in the way they watched him, in the gestures they made when he passed. Signs that reminded him of something he'd seen in an old film adaptation of Dune. Hand signals that carried meaning in their precision. A warning. A warding. A prayer against contamination. Shariel led him to a chamber that might have been her home. The walls were smooth and slightly warm to the touch, pulsing with a heartbeat he could feel through his gloves. She gestured for him to sit, and when he did, she sat across from him and began to vibrate. Not move. Vibrate. Her whole body became a tuning fork, and Eli felt it in his bones before he understood it in his mind. This was how they spoke when they wanted to be truly heard, through resonance. Through the language of frequency itself. She was trying to teach him. Over the next hours or days, time losing meaning in the eternal twilight of the subglacial city, Eli began to understand fragments. The Narathi communicated through vibration patterns that traveled through water and ice and flesh. Their songs weren't sung, they were felt. When Shariel touched his arm and hummed a pattern into his skin, he saw images, memories, not his own. He saw the Narathi history, transmitted through Shariel's touch, like a data download made of sensation. 12,000 lunar cycles ago, the ancient humans had come. They'd brought liquid fire, petroleum, metal machines, infinite greed. The sacred currents had burned. A third of the Narathi population had died in the thermal bloom. They'd sworn, never again. Every warm-blooded species was an enemy by definition. The Galactic Aquatic Council, a coalition of sentient aquatic species that Eli hadn't known existed, had classified humanity as species 247H, Thermal Anomaly Class Omega. They'd concluded it was impossible for humans to reach their technological level before thermal planetary self-destruction. The irony, Shariel's memories whispered, was that they'd been correct about the self-destruction part. Until Eli Turner broke the ice. Eli pulled his hand away, overwhelmed. "Why me?" he asked, his voice too loud in the resonant space. "Why choose someone like me?" Shariel tilted her head, processing the crude sonic communication. Then she reached into a woven pouch and pulled out something that made Eli's heart stop. His wedding ring. The one he'd lost months ago during a particularly bad night when the whiskey had made him brave enough to throw it into the sea. She'd found it. or perhaps it had found her. She placed it in his palm and vibrated a pattern that he almost understood. Debt, bond, current, heat. She'd chosen him because he'd saved her life, because her culture demanded it, not because she loved him, not yet. Maybe not ever. The realization should have hurt. Instead, it felt honest in a way nothing had felt honest in years. Eli closed his fist around the ring and felt its weight. Evidence of one failed marriage, foundation of another impossible one. An elder entered the chamber without warning, moving with the deliberate menace of something ancient and angry. Later, Eli would learn his name. Vornash, 200 years old, scarred from battles with things that had no names in human languages, skeptical of every warm breath Eli took. He stopped in front of Eli and stared down with eyes like frozen nitrogen. When he spoke, his vibrations were harsh, discordant, designed to cause pain. Sharael vibrated back, sharp and defiant. An argument was happening in frequencies Eli could barely perceive. He caught fragments through Sharael's translation, her hand pressed against his shoulder. Vornash was calling him contamination, calling the bond void, calling for Eli's memory to be dissolved, his neurons unraveled, his consciousness scattered to prevent him from ever revealing this place. It was legal under their laws. Precedent, none in 4,000 cycles. Article 47 of the Pact of the Depths stated it clearly. No gaseous breathing species could know the coordinates of underwater sanctuaries. Penalty, neurological dissolution or physical elimination. Exceptions, none. But Sharael had invoked the older law, Kamir, guardian of the breath, and even Vornash, ancient and unyielding, could not override it, not yet. He left with a final vibration that Eli felt like a blade against his ribs, a threat, a countdown. Eli would have to prove his worth, or the exception would become his execution. That night, alone in the small chamber Sharael had designated as his, Eli found his journal. He'd brought it without thinking, a habit from his photography work. He opened it to a page he'd written 3 years ago, words he'd forgotten but never escaped. Day 47 in Alaska. The entry read, Sarah called, asked when I was coming back. Didn't answer. Don't know where home is anymore. Marcus died here. Maybe I already died too. Just didn't notice. He closed the journal and looked at his hands. They were shaking, not from cold, from something that felt dangerously close to hope or terror. He couldn't tell the difference anymore. 3 days later, Eli made his first mistake. He tried to photograph the ritual. The Narathi gathered in a central chamber where the bioluminescence pulsed in patterns that defied optical sensors. Eli watched as they formed a circle, their bodies synchronizing into a single harmonic frequency that he felt in his chest. He lifted his camera, thinking only of documentation, of scientific validation, of the habit that had kept him sane through 3 years of isolation. The shutter clicked once. The sound was a gunshot in the reverent silence. The ritual stopped. Every Narathi turned to look at him. Sharael's expression was something new. Betrayal. She left him there. Walked away without a word, without a vibration, without even the courtesy of anger. Eli stood alone in the chamber as the others dispersed, their movements conveying disgust more clearly than any words. He'd violated something sacred, commodified something holy, proved that he was, after all, just another human who took more than he gave. Vornash appeared from the shadows. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His presence was message enough. Eli had 5 days to leave, or the dissolution would begin. Eli spent those 5 days in his chamber, his hands shaking worse than ever, his mind cycling through every justification and finding none that mattered. On the 5th day, hypothermia began to set in. The Narathi had stopped providing him with the thermal wraps that kept him alive in the sub-zero environment. He was being passively killed by neglect, and some part of him recognized it as exactly what he deserved. On the 6th day, when he was too weak to stand, Sharael returned. She brought with her a garment, woven from bioluminescent fibers, a parka that glowed with soft blue light. She placed it around his shoulders without touching his skin, and Eli felt warmth flow back into his body. Then she sat across from him and began to vibrate, and this time he understood every frequency. You heard us. You took without asking. You saw us as subjects, not souls. He had no defense. He could only say what was true. I'm sorry. I was scared. I didn't know how else to prove I was real. Shariel stopped vibrating. In the silence, Eli heard his own heartbeat, irregular, failing, evidence of a body in crisis and a mind that had given up. Then she did something unprecedented. She laughed. It was her first vocal sound, awkward and unpracticed, but unmistakably human in its attempt. The sound of someone trying to learn the language of another species, one impossible syllable at a time. She touched his chest, felt his heartbeat, and vibrated a pattern that translated as, broken things still beat. Maybe that's the point. Later, much later, he would learn that a young Nerethi named Laketh had been watching him during those 5 days, had recorded in their own journal, I saw the human cry. Didn't understand. Asked Shariel, is he injured? She answered, yes, always was. But keep swimming. That's not logical. That's not possible. That's inspirational. Though the elder Vornash had ordered Laketh to stop observing, they disobeyed. They needed to understand. And so did Eli. As Shariel settled beside him, sharing the warmth of the bioluminescent parka, he realized that healing wasn't the same as being whole. Maybe it was just the decision to keep swimming when drowning was easier. The hydrophone picked up the transmission 48 hours before the ship arrived. Eli was learning to navigate the subglacial currents with Shariel when the alarm vibrated through every surface. A frequency that meant danger. A frequency that meant humans. He surfaced in the central chamber to find the council assembled, their bodies rigid with something that might have been fear or might have been rage. Vornash stood at the center, and when he played back the intercepted transmission, Eli heard his own doom in the crackling voice of the NOAA research vessel Aurora's captain. Detected anomalous acoustic signals in the Bering Strait. Pattern doesn't correspond to known whales. Spectral analysis suggests structured communication. Requesting authorization for deep dive. Coordinates were redacted on the recording, but Eli knew them. Everyone knew them. The humans were coming, and they were bringing equipment that could map every centimeter of the subglacial world. The Narathi would be discovered, studied, dissected by curiosity that called itself science. Eli knew this because he was supposed to be part of it. Before the ice, before Shariel, he'd been on a waiting list for that very expedition. Had wanted to be the one to discover whatever was making those strange songs beneath the strait. Now he stood on the other side of discovery, understanding what it meant to be found when you'd spent millennia hiding. The council convened in emergency session. Eli wasn't allowed to attend, but Shariel brought him the decision through vibrations that felt like grief. 3 options existed. Thermal attack, releasing spores lethal to warm-blooded life, collapse the entrance, permanent sealing, forced migration, abandoning the ancestral sanctuary. The vote was 67% for option 2, but there was a requirement, a sacrifice. The guardian of the breath, Eli Turner, must activate the thermal explosives that would seal the tunnel. He must choose it voluntarily. The probability of human acceptance, according to their calculations, was 2%. They were giving him a choice. Stay human and watch the Narathi die or be discovered, or become something else entirely. Vornash arrived at his chamber that night with an offer. We can dissolve your memory, the elder vibrated through Shariel's translation. Return you to the surface. You would forget us, forget her, live the rest of your human life in peace. We would migrate, hide deeper. Your species would never know we existed. Eli sat with his hands pressed against the warm walls, feeling the heartbeat of the city through his palms. That's the logical choice, he said. Yes, Vornash agreed. Logic is survival. Your species understands this, even if you practice it poorly. Why give me the choice at all? Why not just do it? For a long moment, Vornash didn't respond. Then, because you are Katmir, because Sharael would never forgive us, because even after 200 years, I'm uncertain whether mercy is weakness or strength. I watch you, human, and I see something that should not exist. Something that breaks every rule we have learned about warm-blooded species. You are dying here. Your body is failing. The medical scans we took show elevated blood pressure, irregular heartbeats, chronic hypothermia, elevated cortisol, low dopamine, traces of ethanol. You are, by every biological metric, in gradual self-dissolution. Estimated time to collapse, 18 to 24 months. You are worth nothing by our calculations. And yet, Sharael believes you are worth everything. I want to understand why. Eli laughed, a sound sharp with edges. I'm nobody. I'm a photographer with a dead friend and a failed marriage. I came here to freeze to death slowly enough that it looked like work. Your scans are right. I've been dying for 3 years. Just took me until now to notice. Then why not accept my offer? Forget. Return. Die in peace. Eli closed his eyes, remembered Marcus in the water, remembered the weight of his body, the cold that had felt like fire. Remembered Sarah's voice on the phone. You love this place more than any person, Eli. You're already dead. He'd believed her, had built a life inside that belief. But then he'd pulled Sharael from the ice and something had shifted. Not fixed. Shifted. Like a bone set wrong that could still bear weight if you learned to walk differently. Because, Eli said finally, someone needs to. And I'm someone. Vornash made a sound that wasn't quite a vibration, wasn't quite a voice. That is not logical. No, Eli agreed. It's not. The elder left. The offer remained open. Eli had 3 days to decide. On the second day, Sharael found the note. Eli had tucked it into his journal before descending, a habit from his darker nights. Insurance. Just in case. She couldn't read English, but she understood the weight of words meant to be found after death. She brought it to him, held it between them like evidence of a crime. When he reached for it, she pulled back and did something that terrified him more than any threat from Vornash. She began to read it aloud, phonetically, without understanding. If someone finds this... Stop, Eli said. Please. She didn't. She continued, mangling the pronunciation, but capturing the meaning through the rhythm of the words. Not accident. Chose ice. It chose back. No one to blame. Sarah, you were right. I already dead. Just took time for body to notice. Sorry, Marcus. Tried to live. Big. Couldn't. The silence after was worse than the words. Sharael set the paper down gently as if it might shatter. Then she vibrated, and the frequency was so raw it felt like being cut open. You were going to leave us before you met us. You were going to leave me before I had the chance to know you. Yes, Eli said, because there was no point in lying. Why save me then? Why break the ice? I don't know. Reflex. Instinct. Maybe I saw someone else drowning and remembered what it felt like. Sharael moved closer, and Eli saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. Not affection. Not yet. But recognition. The acknowledgement that pain was a current that flowed through all species. That drowning felt the same whether you breathed air or water. She touched his chest, felt his heartbeat, and began to teach him something new. How to feel the electromagnetic fields that the Narathi use to sense each other in total darkness. How to hear with skin instead of ears. For the first time, Eli felt her. Not just the surface temperature, but the resonance beneath. The frequency of her fear, her hope, her strange alien equivalent of what humans might call love, if they were brave enough to name it. She was terrified, not of the humans coming, of him leaving, of choosing dissolution and forgetting her, of proving that connection was always temporary, that eventually everyone drowns alone. "I won't forget you," Eli said. "I promise." "Then stay," she vibrated. "Help us, even if it costs everything." On the third day, Eli made his decision. He would activate the explosives, seal the entrance, save the Narathi, and likely die in the process, because no human had ever survived at the depths required for the detonation. He told Shariel, expecting relief. Instead, she grabbed his shoulders with a force that left bruises and vibrated a frequency that felt like screaming. "Run with me," she said. "Leave my people. Let them die or hide or be discovered. Choose yourself. Choose us. Be selfish for once in your broken human life." Eli stared at her, shocked by the offer, tempted by it in a way that made him hate himself. He almost said yes. Almost took her hand and fled to the surface, abandoning an entire species for the chance at something that might have been happiness. For 30 seconds, he was that selfish, that human, that desperate for warmth. Then he thought about Marcus giving him his thermal suit, about how survival sometimes meant letting others live at your expense, about how the only thing he'd ever been good at was dying in ways that looked heroic enough to matter. "I can't," he said. "You know I can't." Shariel released him, turned away. He thought she would leave, but she didn't. She just stood there, her body vibrating with a frequency he'd never heard before, and Eli realized with horror that he was hearing her cry. Not with water, with sound. With the resonance of grief that had no outlet, no expression, no word in either language. Hours later, young Laketh approached him in secret, their movements furtive. They carried a device cobbled together from human salvage and Narathi biotech, a translator that could render vibrations into crude English words. "The council doesn't know I'm here," Laketh's device buzzed. "But I had to tell someone. The explosives won't work at depth without a human operator. The thermal signature required needs body heat at the ignition point. You have to go down there, 200 meters. No equipment can sustain you. You'll die." "I know," Eli said. "Then why?" Eli thought about it. Thought about every reason that made sense and discarded them all for the one that didn't. "Because she's crying," he said, "and I can't stand it." Laketh tilted their head, processing this impossible logic. "You would die to stop her sadness? Wouldn't you?" The young Narathi had no answer, just backed away slowly, their bioluminescence pulsing in a pattern that Eli's developing sensitivity recognized as awe or horror, possibly both. The next morning, the aurora would arrive. The countdown was ending. Eli stood at the edge of the thermal vent shaft, looking down into darkness that sang with frequencies he was only beginning to understand. Shariel stood beside him, not touching, not speaking, just present. Vornash approached with the detonation device, crude explosives stolen from a human mining operation decades ago, repurposed for this singular moment of self-preservation through self-destruction. The elder held out the device. Eli took it. Their hands, separated by gloves and fundamental biology, did not touch. But Vornash vibrated one final message, transmitted through the metal itself. "If you survive, human, I will learn your word, the one that makes no sense. Love. I will learn what it means." Eli nodded, began his descent. Behind him, Shariel's vibrations followed him down like a prayer, like a song, like a plea for the universe to break its own rules just this once. And Eli, who'd been half dead for 3 years, who'd chosen ice over warmth and solitude over risk, who'd lost everything except the compulsion to document his own slow disappearance, finally understood what Marcus had meant when he'd said those last words through chattering teeth. "Live big, Eli, for both of us." This was living big, even if it killed him, especially if it killed him. Because some things were worth dying for. And maybe, just maybe, that meant they'd been worth living for all along. The descent took 17 minutes. Eli counted each one, not because time mattered anymore, but because the pain gave him something to focus on besides the screaming in his lungs. 200 meters down, the pressure should have crushed his ribcage like paper. Instead, his bones flexed and creaked, adapting in ways that violated every principle of human physiology. His ears bled, his vision tunneled. His core temperature dropped to 32 degrees Celsius, then 30, then 28. Clinically dead by human standards. Still conscious, still moving. The Narathi monitoring his descent transmitted data in real time, their frequencies laced with disbelief. Anomalous biometric readings, the report would state. Human Eli Turner survived 47 minutes underwater without breathing equipment. Body temperature 28 degrees. Heart rate 12 beats per minute, still conscious, still moving. Impossible according to known human physiology. Conclusion: humans do not obey their own limitations when emotional motivation exceeds survival instinct. Philosophical implications: reevaluate all understanding of warm-blooded species. But Eli didn't feel impossible. He felt like he was dying one cell at a time, each nerve ending shutting down in sequential failure, his body cannibalizing itself for the energy to keep his brain firing just a little longer. Long enough to reach the detonation point, long enough to set the charges, long enough to press the button that would seal the entrance and save a species that wasn't his own. His hands shook so badly he almost dropped the device twice. The cold had penetrated through his thermal suit, through his skin, into the marrow of his bones. He wedged the explosives into the fracture point Vornash had marked with bioluminescent paint. The rock was warm here, heated by geothermal vents that kept the subglacial cave system habitable. Eli's frozen fingers fumbled with the detonator, setting the timer for 2 minutes. Enough time to get clear. Theoretically. He just activated the countdown when his lungs finally gave out. The involuntary gasp pulled in water instead of air, and Eli's body convulsed in the primal panic of drowning. His vision went white, then dark, then somewhere beyond dark, where thoughts became colors and pain became music. He was aware, distantly, that he was dying, that his neurons were firing their last desperate signals, his consciousness fragmenting into the static between thoughts. He felt something like peace, or maybe just the absence of the ability to feel anything else. Then Sha'arel was there. He didn't see her approach, didn't hear her, just suddenly felt her body against his, her arms wrapping around him, her face pressing close to his. Her gills opened against his cheeks, and she breathed for him, not metaphorically, literally. She took the dissolved oxygen from the water and transferred it directly into his lungs through a biological mechanism that had no name in human languages. A kiss that was also a transfusion. An intimacy that was also a medical procedure. The first time in the history of both species that a human had breathed like a Narathi. Eli's consciousness snapped back into focus with a clarity that hurt worse than the dying had. He could feel everything. Not just the oxygen flowing into his blood, but the vibrations of Sha'arel's entire being, transmitted through the points where their bodies touched. He experienced her fear, her determination, her absolute refusal to let him die alone. And beneath that, he felt something else. The electromagnetic field she'd been teaching him to sense. It surrounded them both now, pulsing in synchronization, two hearts beating as one frequency. For a moment that stretched into eternity, Eli understood what it meant to be Narathi, to be connected to every current, every flow, every molecule of water in the endless ocean. To never truly be alone because loneliness itself was impossible when you could feel the resonance of every living thing. The timer hit 0. The explosives detonated. The tunnel collapsed in a cascade of ice and rock that sounded like the end of the world. The shockwave hit them both, and Eli felt Sha'arel's grip tighten, felt her body shield his from the worst of the debris. They tumbled in the darkness, locked together, still breathing in that impossible rhythm. When the dust settled, the entrance was gone, sealed. The Narathi were safe. The humans would find nothing but a collapsed ice shelf and would eventually leave, frustrated, but none the wiser about what lived beneath. Eli and Sharael were trapped at the bottom of the sealed shaft. No way out, no rescue coming. The water around them was growing colder as the geothermal vents redirected their flow away from the dead zone. Within hours, this entire section would freeze solid. They would become part of the ice, part of the permanent structure that protected the Narathi from discovery. "You came down," Eli tried to say, but the words came out as vibrations, not sounds. He was speaking her language now, his vocal cords damaged beyond the capacity for human speech. "You weren't supposed to follow." "I chose," Sharael vibrated back. "Like you chose. We are both idiots by our species' standards. Maybe that makes us perfect for each other." Eli would have laughed if he'd still had the breath for it. Instead, he pressed his forehead against hers and felt her electromagnetic field merge with his, two distinct patterns becoming one complex harmony. "I'm not afraid," he vibrated. "I'm with you." "You taught me to breathe outside water," Sharael responded. "I taught you to breathe inside it. Now we are neither. We are both. We are something new." Above them, in the city, the Narathi were processing what had happened. Young Leketh was already recording it in their journal, words that would become historical record. The human chose death so others could live. Not logical, not possible, but real. And Sharael, who represented logic and tradition, chose to die with him, to make his sacrifice not a lonely ending but a shared transformation. Elder Vornash, 200 years old and certain in his understanding of the universe, felt something break inside his chest, a feeling he'd never experienced. He searched his vast vocabulary for a word and found none that fit. Later, when describing it to the council, he would use the human word: grief. For a creature he'd wanted to eliminate. For a sacrifice he'd demanded but never expected to witness. He cried for the first time in 2 centuries, his body vibrating with frequencies that made the young ones uncomfortable because they'd never seen an elder show such weakness, or such strength. The line between the two had become impossible to distinguish. The council convened immediately. 51% voted to honor Eli and Sharael by establishing a new law. The Sharael-Turner Protocol, it would be called, formally recorded 6 months after the sealing. No human would be judged by the crimes of their species. Each would be evaluated by individual actions. The first exception to Article 47 in 4,000 lunar cycles. Co-authors, Elder Sharael, presumed dead but spiritually present, and Elder Vornash, reluctant but convinced. Status, approved. On the surface, the Aurora found only collapsed ice and dead equipment. They waited 3 days, then returned to port with data that suggested tectonic activity had destroyed whatever signal source they'd detected. The mysterious songs of the Bering Strait became another unsolved mystery, another footnote in the long list of things humans suspected but could never prove. In a small apartment in Seattle, Sarah Chen received a visit from 2 FBI agents who asked her about her ex-husband Elijah Turner, wanted for questioning regarding potential treason and obstruction of scientific research. She told them the truth. He's an idiot, stubborn, suicidal, but not a traitor. Whatever he's doing up there, I hope he finally found something worth living for. I wasn't, but maybe they are. The agents left unsatisfied. Sarah stood at her window looking north toward Alaska and cried for the first time since signing the divorce papers 5 years ago. Not because she wanted him back, because she finally understood what he'd been searching for, and was grateful that he might have found it, even if it meant she'd never see him again. At the bottom of the sealed shaft, Eli's body temperature stabilized at exactly 0 degrees Celsius. Not frozen, not warm. Suspended at the threshold between states. His heartbeat slowed to 1 beat every 75 seconds. Sharael's matched it perfectly, Their electromagnetic fields had merged so completely that monitoring equipment could no longer distinguish between them. They were becoming something that had no precedent in the biological records of either species. Not dead, not entirely alive. Transforming into a new form of existence that existed in the space between breath and stillness, between heat and ice, between human and Narathi. Their last conscious thought, transmitted as a shared vibration that echoed through the ice. This is what love means. Not completion, not perfection, just the choice to keep breathing with someone, even when breathing becomes the hardest thing you've ever done. 3 years later, a different research vessel would find them, or what they had become. But that story belonged to the future. For now, in the eternal darkness at the bottom of the Bering Strait, two beings who should never have met learned the final lesson of their impossible bond. The breath belongs to both worlds. It always had. They just needed to be crazy enough to prove it. 3 years after the sealing, the Inouye Expedition 2027 descended into the Bering Strait on a mission to map unexplored thermal vent systems. They weren't looking for anything extraordinary. Just rock formations, mineral deposits, baseline ecological surveys. Marine biologist Dr. James Park was operating the submersible when his sonar picked up an anomaly at 200 meters. A structure too regular to be natural, too isolated to be man-made infrastructure. He maneuvered closer, and his external lights revealed something that would redefine everything humanity thought it knew about the ocean. A statue. Two figures locked in an embrace, their bodies intertwined so completely that it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. The form on the left was clearly human, male, broad-shouldered and bearded, even in crystalline suspension. The form on the right was something else entirely. Elongated limbs, smooth skin that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, features that suggested intelligence but defied terrestrial taxonomy. They were frozen together, or perhaps fused at the bottom of the strait. Their eyes were closed, their faces peaceful. Around them the water pulsed with a faint blue bioluminescence that matched no known organism. Dr. Park took samples, ran every test his equipment allowed. The DNA analysis from the human figure came back with a match. Elijah Turner, reported missing in 2024 after last being seen in Utqiagvik, Alaska. Wanted for questioning by federal authorities. Presumed dead after 3 years with no contact. The other figure's DNA was unlike anything in the database. Not fish, not mammal, not anything terrestrial, but definitely organic, definitely alive, if the term still had meaning. The most disturbing discovery came from the thermal imaging. Despite being at the bottom of the freezing Bering Strait, despite all physical laws that should have rendered them as cold as the surrounding water, the statue was warm. 0.8 degrees Celsius above ambient. And it pulsed, not randomly, rhythmically. Once every 75 seconds, a heartbeat, shared between two beings who shouldn't be breathing at all. Dr. Park recommended immediate extraction and study. The expedition leader overrode him. Something about the statue felt sacred in a way that transcended scientific curiosity. They documented it thoroughly, established it as a protected site, and left it untouched. The official report, filed 3 months later, classified the location as an international scientific sanctuary. The statue was never moved, never disturbed, just visited occasionally by researchers who stood in reverent silence, trying to understand what they were looking at: a tomb, a monument, a mystery, or perhaps all three. Below the statue, carved into the bedrock in symbols that would take linguists 7 years to partially translate, was an inscription. The language was related to Proto-Inuit dialects, but divergent enough to suggest a separate evolutionary branch. The translation, when it finally came, was simple and devastating. The breath belongs to both worlds. 50 years after the sealing, in a subglacial city that humanity still didn't know existed, a young Narathi historian named Tessera, granddaughter of the legendary Leketh, stood before the council to present her research. She was the first of her generation born after the Turner-Sharail Protocol, raised in a culture that had been fundamentally altered by the actions of a single human and a single Narathi who'd chosen love over logic. Tessera's name wasn't coincidence. Her grandmother Laketh had chosen it deliberately, inspired by the last message ever received from the surface, transmitted by a human woman named Sarah Chen before all contact was lost. The message had said, "I hope he found something worth living for." Laketh had taken that name as a prayer, a promise that the sacrifice would be remembered across generations. "Today is the day of shared breath," Tessera vibrated to the assembled council, her frequencies carrying to every corner of the great chamber. Celebrated by both species, humans descend in thermal capsules designed by Narathi engineers. We rise in heating suits crafted by human hands. We sing together, where once there was only silence, all because one human broke the ice and one Narathi broke the law. Elder Sharail taught my grandmother's generation a truth that changed us forever. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is swimming toward what terrifies you because someone you love is drowning. The council listened in silence. Vornash, now 300 years old and barely able to maintain physical form, vibrated his approval from the honored elder position. He'd spent the last 50 years studying human psychology, anthropology, philosophy, learning what the word love meant. He'd concluded, in a paper that became required reading for all young Narathi, that love was the ultimate irrational act, and that irrationality, when properly applied, could change the universe. He'd been wrong about humans, wrong about heat, wrong about the assumption that warmth only destroyed. Sometimes he'd written, "Warmth is exactly what freezing things need to survive." Tessera continued her address. Eli Turner showed us that even those who consider themselves dead can choose to live by choosing something greater than themselves. He was, by every measure, a broken creature, suffering from trauma, depression, guilt. He came to us already dying, and yet he chose sacrifice, chose connection, chose us over his own species. Not because we earned it, not because he was perfect, but because someone needed to, and he was someone. That's the lesson we teach our young now, that being broken doesn't disqualify you from being brave, that the most profound acts of heroism often come from those who have nothing left to lose except their fear. On the surface, in a small marine research facility in Seattle, Dr. Park was giving his own lecture to a group of graduate students. They gathered around a holographic display showing the statue at the bottom of the strait. The bioluminescence had grown brighter over the years, spreading through the surrounding rock like roots of light. When viewed through infrared cameras, the pattern formed a shape, a mathematical symbol, the infinity loop, perfect and eternal, visible only to those who knew to look in the right spectrum. "We don't know what they've become," Dr. Park told his students. "The working theory is a form of suspended animation, a biological stasis achieved through mechanisms we don't understand. But the consciousness readings we've detected suggest they're aware. Not in the way we think of awareness, more like a dream that never ends. A shared existence outside normal biological parameters. Some of my colleagues call it death. I call it transformation. They chose each other over survival. And somehow, impossibly, that choice became its own form of survival." One of his students raised a hand. "Have you ever tried to communicate with them?" Dr. Park smiled. "Once. I touched the statue during a dive, and I felt something. Not words, not thoughts. A vibration, a frequency. It translated in my mind as a single phrase." He paused, remembering the moment, the way his entire body had resonated with a warmth that shouldn't exist at that depth. "Keep swimming. For us." 50 years and 3 months after the sealing, a human mining operation accidentally breached a small thermal vent near the statue's location. The breach lasted 17 seconds before Narathi repair crews sealed it from below. But in those 17 seconds, something changed. The statue's bioluminescence flared brighter than ever recorded. The heartbeat pattern accelerated to once every 30 seconds, and every monitoring device within 5 kilometers registered a frequency spike that translated, through the hybrid communication systems developed over 5 decades of secret cooperation between species, as a single shared emotion. Joy. They were still there, still aware, still connected, still choosing each other across years and distance, and the fundamental impossibility of their existence. The brief exposure to warmer water from the surface had reminded them of what they'd given up, and what they'd gained. A different researcher might have seen tragedy in their condition. Dr. Park, kneeling on the deck of his vessel as the data streamed in, saw only the most profound act of love he'd ever witnessed. That night, alone in his cabin, he wrote a letter to Sarah Chen, now 73 years old, and living in a retirement community in Oregon. She still kept Eli's wedding ring in a box by her bed, still looked north sometimes and wondered if he'd found what he was looking for. The letter told her everything, about the statue, about the bioluminescence, about the day the vibrations formed a message she needed to hear. 2 weeks later, Sarah took a charter boat to the coordinates Dr. Park had provided. She couldn't dive, couldn't reach them, but she stood at the rail and looked down at the water where Eli had disappeared. She pulled out the wedding ring she'd kept for over 50 years and held it up to the light. Then she put it back in her pocket. "You always were an idiot," she said to the waves. "But you were right. About the ice. About finding something worth dying for. I'm glad you found her. I'm glad you became this. Whatever this is." The water around the boat began to glow, soft blue light rising from the depths. The captain, a young man who'd grown up hearing legends about the Singing Strait, cut the engines and stood in silence. Sarah felt a vibration through the hull of the boat. Not random, rhythmic. A pattern that she somehow understood despite having no training in Narathi communication. A simple message from her ex-husband and the creature who'd become his wife, and his death, and his eternal companion. "Thank you for letting me go, for understanding too late but not too late enough to matter, for being here now." Sarah cried, but she was smiling. "Keep swimming, you stubborn bastard, for both of us." Below, in their crystalline embrace, Eli and Sharael continued their infinite dance between life and death, between human and Narathi, between all the things they'd been and all the things they'd become. They were a tomb that breathed, a monument that dreamed. A mystery that had solved itself by refusing to choose between impossible options. They were proof that sometimes the only way to keep swimming is to let yourself sink. That sometimes the only way to breathe is to share breath with someone who breathes differently. That sometimes the only way to survive is to transform into something neither species has words for, but both understand. The breath belongs to both worlds. It always did. They just needed to be crazy enough to prove it. Broken enough to try, human enough to fail, and loved enough to succeed anyway. That's the thing about humanity, the Narathi would write in their updated cultural codex, entry authored by Tessera and approved by Vornash in his final act before dissolution. They don't win by being stronger or smarter or more logical. They win by refusing to accept that winning and losing are the only options. They rewrite the rules by breaking them so thoroughly that new rules have to be invented just to explain what they've done. And in doing so, they teach us that perhaps our rules were always too small, too certain, too afraid of the spaces between categories where real transformation lives. Eli Turner was nobody, a broken photographer with a dead friend and a failed marriage. He died saving a species that wasn't his own, and in dying, he lived more fully than most beings live in 10 normal lifetimes. That's not tragedy. That's not sacrifice. That's just love, in its purest and most irrational form. And love, as it turns out, is the only force in the universe that can make the impossible merely improbable, and the improbable inevitable, and the inevitable eternal. The current remembers, the ice remembers, the breath between worlds remembers. And that, in the end, is all that any of us can hope for. To be remembered not for what we were, but for what we chose to become when the universe said it was impossible. Humanity, in all its broken glory, said, "Watch us anyway." Maybe the universe never needed gods, only beings foolish enough to love in defiance of entropy. Eli and Sharael didn't save the galaxy. They didn't end war or erase hate. They just proved that the line between species, between logic and emotion, between life and death, is thinner than we think, and that crossing it might be the only truly human act there is. Because in the coldest depths of existence, it wasn't strength that endured, it was warmth. What do you think keeps us alive when logic says we shouldn't be? Would you have chosen survival or meaning? And when your time comes, would you rather be remembered for what you achieved or for what you dared to feel? If this story made you remember what breath really means, write the word current in the comments, just to show you stayed until the end. Tell me, from which city or which world are you watching? Subscribe. If you believe stories like this remind us what we're still capable of. Like, share, and click on the next tale. Because as long as someone remembers, the current between worlds keeps flowing.